Okay, so good afternoon, everybody. I'm Jeremy Hughes, the Vice Chair of the World Dementia Council. For those who've joined before, you'll know that every Tuesday afternoon at 4 o'clock, we have a live conversation on the theme of healthy aging and have a range of speakers that hopefully stimulate you to think about age and the opportunities we have as we get older to live as well as possible, including people living with dementia and the challenges that inevitably places on your life, but also the opportunities. So if you haven't already got yourself a cup of tea, now's the chance before we begin in a few minutes' time at 4 o'clock. But my guest today, I'll be introducing in a few minutes. But just to give you a bit of background, I was reflecting how important these conversations have already proved to lots of people who are facing the isolation that comes with lockdown. People who are self-isolating in the shielded population, and we know that there's something like 2 million people who've been shielding and protecting themselves during coronavirus. It can be a very lonely time because you're removed from family members, you're removed from many of the routine things that provide the support and protection for everyday life that you're got used to. I know from my personal experience that that's happened with my mother-in-law, whose routine, and she's got early Alzheimer's, her routine's been disrupted and it's been quite difficult to live with. So I hope that these conversations provide a good opportunity to just take a break, have a cup of tea, join in with the guest speaker that I have every week, and let yourselves think about the fact that you're part of a community of support, that none of us are alone, even if we're isolated and away from others. The wonders of modern technology means we can still connect and we can still talk to each other and understand how to let people live as well as possible in what are very difficult times. And of course, sometimes it's developing new approaches and different things that we can do to make life better supported. Care Vision's Healthy Aging, who sponsor these programs and put it out on their Facebook site, have done that themselves. So from being a provider of care and support in the community, and they've done this internationally as well as in the UK, they're now producing very effective dementia therapy videos that you can get online and you can watch on their YouTube site. And that's a good cue to just introduce my guest speaker today. So I'm delighted to have joining me for the next half an hour, Terry Waite, the humanitarian and author, who became very well known, of course, in the late 1980s through the role he played in the hostage crisis in Lebanon, and himself became a hostage for over 4 years when he was trying to secure the release of John McCarthy. So Terry has become a national figure, but has developed a career really as a humanitarian and author and contributes so much to the local community. And Terry himself, to go back to Care Visions, has provided a couple of reminiscence videos which are on their site, which gives you an insight into how he relates to his past and the things that we all remember. Mrs. Dale's diaries, the Archers, other things that Terry mentions on those videos, I'm sure resonate with so many of us as we think about not just the world we live in today, but the world that we've grown up in over the last many years and the part it contributes. So Terry, thank you so much for joining me today. I think you're in your house in Suffolk, is that right?
I am, yes. I'm in what was the old barn. You probably can see the beams in this barn. The house was built, around about 13 or 1400. So I think it's about time I redecorated, don't you?
And have you lived there a long time yourself? Have you been there for a while?
Well, we've been in this house for about 20 years. We have a house in London, and right. At the beginning of this lockdown, my wife preferred to stay in London to be near the children and grandchildren because we'd no idea which way things were going to go. And I said I would come up here and look after here. So I've been here by myself for, since March now.
Right.
And the only people I've seen is when someone's called to do my shopping, which is very good of them because I live in a small village.
And you weren't originally from Suffolk yourself. I think you're from the northwest. Is that right? Is that your Cheshire, your family home?
Yes, I was born and brought up in a village called Stile, and if anyone looks on the web, you'll see many films about Stile Mill, which was one of the first industrial mills in this country, and it was a little village. It still is a little village. It's a National Trust village today. And my father was the village policeman. And right. So I could never get away with any mischief. You know?
You were kept well in order.
Well in order.
Terry, thank you again for joining me today. You had your birthday, I think just last month, your 81st birthday. And when we were talking before coming online, you were saying how your 80th birthday, in a sense, was a key point where you suddenly felt you had moved into a different age. Can you tell me a little bit more about what it means to be in your 80s? How have you adapted, or how have you developed your outlook on life in your 80s?
Well, I said to you, if I remember, at least I said it to somebody, when I had my 80th birthday, I felt I was just about leaving adolescence. By that, I meant, of course, that in many ways, there are a lot of benefits from getting older. You look back on life, of course, and you recognize that it's been a life full of many different events. And you look back and you say, well, I was right there and I was wrong in that position. You can't be too depressed about the mistakes you've made, but you can learn from them. And one of the things I've tried to do across life is accept life as it comes, to take it as it comes, a step at a time. And getting older can be a remarkably positive time. You have perhaps a little more time to do some of the things that you perhaps have promised yourself to do. And that is, for instance, I've been able to catch up with reading. And I feel it's very important that when you do get older, and perhaps when those who've retired and get older and have given up a full-time job for whatever reason, either retirement or illness, that you keep your brain active. I mean, when I was in captivity, I was chained to the wall for 23 hours and 50 minutes a day. And I did almost 5 years in that position, only leaving the room, a dark room with no light, no natural light, and no books or papers. I only left that room once a day and never saw the outside world apart from 2 brief glimpses. And so in that situation, there was very limited physical exercise and there was very limited mental stimulation because I had no books, no one to talk with. And I realized then that the secret of survival was to keep your brain alive, to exercise it. Someone once said to me, they said, the brain is like a muscle. Mm-hmm. If you don't use it, you lose it. And I then challenged myself to think in captivity, how can I do that? And first of all, I began to write in my head. I wrote my first book, which is called Taken on Trust. I wrote that in my head without pencil and paper because I never had pencil and paper. I began to compose poetry. And later on, again, much later when I came out, I remembered some of it and published that in a book. And I just tried to keep something new. Now, when I came out of captivity, I felt it was very important also to keep my brain alive, to keep it stimulated. So, for example, in these last 2 months now? Anyway, since March, April, May, yes, going in 3 months now, going into 3 months. What I've tried to do is do something new. I've always wanted to play the ukulele. You wouldn't want to listen to me. So I bought myself a ukulele and attempting to play that. I've written serious books before, but I thought, have a complete change. And I'm just completing now my 3rd volume of children's stories. I've written 3 books for children, specifically intended to be read to children by adults, but they can be read by children independently. Again, another new genre, another way of working. So I think. So
can you give us an insight? Can you give us a sneak preview of the stories in your children's books? What characters do you develop in your children's books? Yeah,
well, I can. Today, just before coming online, I was finishing off a chapter. It's about it's blending fantasy and reality. So I've set the scene in a little village in Suffolk, which is an actual village. And I've set it around a house that is owned by friends of mine, which is an old barn that's been converted into a house. And under the floorboards lives Tommy Twitchnose, who's a mouse, and his family, and all the small animals around. And they have all sorts of adventures together. And of course, they play tricks too on the old man. And today, the name of the town, we've changed it, the real name, I better not give it away, the real name. In actual fact, I've changed the name to a place called Cheesethorpe. And today I've been writing about a cheese festival, which they're having. All these small animals have organized this cheese festival. And so what I'm trying to do is, in the story, in a non-obvious way, is introduce different things, different ideas, different subjects, and yet do it in story form and in fantasy, mixing fantasy and reality. And there's usually a hidden moral to the story. It's not obvious, but it's there in the story. And I just felt there was a need for children's stories, which in some ways go back. I mean, people listening will probably remember the old stories of Beatrix Potter. You know, those lovely stories of the animals, how they got up to all sorts of things. Or Kenneth Graham, Wind in the Willows. And that's a genre I've gone back to and try to write in that way. The first volume, which is called I think it's called The Tales of Tommy Twitchnose, that will be published in September.
Oh, well, we look forward to seeing that, because I remember one that I remember from reading when I was, I don't know what age I was, a teenager or even younger, was Watership Down.
That's right.
In a similar vein of sort of make-believe world, but somehow related to reality as well. You could relate it to your life, although it was about animals and something that was fantasy.
That's exactly the genre, exactly the way I've tried to write it. And so
you're a very accomplished writer. We know that from your book. So I'm sure people will enjoy buying the book when it comes out in September and reading it. But I think one of the messages that go back to your playing the ukulele, which I think is probably true for people as they get older and people particularly living with Alzheimer's and other forms of dementia, is that it doesn't matter how good you get at it. It's the fact that you're making the effort to do something different. I remember talking to the broadcaster Angela Rippon, who did quite a big study into this and said, it's doing something that you haven't always done before. So trying to learn a foreign language or play a musical instrument as you are, the fact that you're stretching exactly as you described, Terry, you're stretching the muscle in your brain to do something it previously didn't do, in itself is very therapeutic and very valuable, as I say, regardless of whether you'll ever get to be playing the ukulele in a concert.
I shall not do it. But just let me tell you one thing about writing. You said you're a very accomplished writer. I can tell you that as a child, I had real difficulty in writing for the very simple fact, to begin with, that I'm left-handed. And in those days, as with probably some people who are watching now, I had to learn to write with a steel nib pen in an inkwell. And the teacher didn't understand what it was to be left-handed. And so we had to write with the letters sloping forward. Now, if you try and write with a steel pen and ink that smudges easily, writing forward, you make a terrible mess. And I used to find writing an absolute pain. And it was only transformed for me when my father, much later in life, gave me his old Olivetti typewriter. And he said, have a go at that. And I then started to, I don't touch type, I just type 2-finger, 3-finger typing. And that transformed it for me. And
did they, when you were at school, did they acknowledge that you were left-handed, or was there very little recognition of the difficulty of?
They never tried to change me to be right-handed, but they insisted that I wrote left-handed in the right-handed way, if you know.
Yes, yes.
That was a big mistake, Yeah. And I also, another mistake I made, my father had a wonderful collection of the works of Charles Dickens, a beautiful collection. I used to read them. I found, when I was quite young, I found Dickens full of words that I'd never heard before. And I thought the way to write was actually to fill the page with big words. So I filmed, I wrote some terrible stuff. But then someone said to me, write simply, write as you feel, write as you might speak, just write simply. And I could say now, for anybody who's never written before, try and put something down on paper to write about your life. That will be of fascinating interest to your children or grandchildren when you've gone. They'll be very interested in that. And also it'll be good for you because it has been proved that by writing things, you again stimulate the mind, stimulate the brain.
Yes. And did you, when you were writing, so you say when you were held captive, you had already started writing your book in your head. Did you sort of set yourself a task every day to do a little bit more, or was it a bit more sporadic than that? I mean, did you have a routine that helped you get through the days?
Well, that's a very good point. If you could imagine being in a very dark room with no natural light, sometimes electric light, sometimes a candle, and you're not sure of the time, you've no watch, you've nothing, but there are shutters in front of the window, metal shutters, and a gleam of light will come through at dawn. So you've got a fixed point there, it's dawn, and when the light goes, of course, it's evening. In a blank open space like that, I learned very quickly, it's very important to form a structure for the day. And that is true now in lockdown. And there's a silly story, but I'll tell you. When I was a young man at the time of national service, and I was in the Grenadier Guards, and I was always told and taught very strictly to maintain my own self-respect and dignity. When I got into captivity, for the first week and the first week only, I had my own clothes, and I was sleeping on the floor on a mattress. And at night, I managed to get my trousers off and put them under the mattress to press them. My guards thought I was crackers. They said, that fellow's mad. What's he doing? But the point was, I was determined to maintain my self-respect. And I think, again, when you get older, that's something to do. I remember when I was young, old people used to dress as old people. They looked old people, and they walked like old people. Well, perhaps some of them couldn't help that. But, the thing is, form a structure for the day. Don't just allow yourself to get up and mess around all day in a dressing gown. Dress properly, take pride in yourself, portion the day as to things to do so that you've got a pattern for the day. All that is really important. I learned all that, really. It was driven home in captivity of how important it is.
And I think you're right. It's important for everybody. And I'm thinking particularly about the subjects that we're covering on this series of conversations, particularly looking at people with Alzheimer's and dementia, and how many people, in effect, are in isolation, even though they've got other people around them. They're in their own little world, and they're not relating well to the people around them. And so it sounds like there's some sort of tricks you can suggest to people of how do you deal with isolation, which, as I say, people might be particularly experiencing at the moment with lockdown, but they might be experiencing because they're living with a disease that makes them feel cut off and not connected to the world they're in today.
Yeah, and I would say also to people who are listening to this, who are not necessarily suffering from the problem, is it is important to talk to people who may not be able to respond. The other day, I did an online meeting with an old lady who was very ill with dementia, and she couldn't or didn't speak. And I was speaking to her. And during the course of this conversation, well, it was one-way conversation, but during the course of this meeting, I simply said to her, if you can hear and understand me, just give me a wave. And she gently lifted her hand and gave me a wave.
That's wonderful.
So I would say, don't think that because someone finds because of the problem they can't respond, they often can listen and understand. And there's an inner world in which they're living, and in part which they're trapped. It's like a captivity. And they can still make something of that captivity. Perhaps not share it with others, but they can make something of it.
But I think that message about the non-verbal communication, and of course, even if you come back to words, one thing we know is when people have Alzheimer's and other forms of dementia, they can often still join in singing songs that they remember, even though they can't speak. They don't have a conversation, but they will join in singing a song that's meant a lot to them, maybe in their childhood or in their youth. And it's a way of people connecting and feeling part of a community.
I'm so glad you raised that, because music is really something that does stimulate a part of the brain, I think, and stimulates you in a new way. Again, there's a little funny story I can tell you about that. I tried to sing in captivity, but the guards came in and said, "Be quiet, you mustn't make a noise, be quiet." So I was not allowed to sing, excepting on one occasion. Once I was kept in a room upstairs somewhere in a bombed out building, and over the corridor I knew there was another hostage, and I didn't know who it was, no idea. And strangely enough, a guard came into the room and he said to me, "Will you sing for me?" I thought, what a strange request. But I thought, here's a chance to get a message across to the other chap in the other room as to who I am. So I thought, right, establish my nationality first of all. So I sang "God Save the Queen." And then I was an envoy of the Archbishop of Canterbury. So then I sang, "Oh God, I help in ages past. Oh God, I help in ages past." You know, and whether the message ever got through, I don't know. But it's just one story about the only time I ever sang in captivity. But today, music is important.
Yeah,
and if
that's
you
amazing.
Join in, it's such an important part of life.
And what about, so you've raised another issue that I wanted to touch on, and then we'll go to, I know some people have sent questions in, so I'll come to those. But one thing I wanted to touch on that you've referred to already is the importance of faith. And I think you coined the phrase, you've become a Anglican, which was a combination of a Quaker and an Anglican. But how important is faith to help people deal with isolation and loneliness? Do you see it as an important anchor and support?
Well, yes, put it this way. And I would speak across the great faith, not solely from a Christian perspective, but across the great faith. The first thing I would say is that God and the concept of God remains a great mystery. Many attempts are made to define God and to understand God, but God still remains a great mystery to all of us. And the various faiths, Christianity, Islam, Judaism, in fact, form their structures and pictures which enable us to get a hold of the mystery. Now, the structures and the formations I would regard as the handrails. Mm-hmm. Handrails are there to guide you towards the mystery that lies beyond yourself and the mystery that is within. And so life is a constant exploration and if you do that in your Christian perspective, you have your pictures, you have your formula, you have your routines. Now that was very helpful to me, the routine of being brought up as a chorister and committing to memory the psalms and the hymns of the church. I could remember them when I was in captivity. But I was very careful to recognize that they are simply the handrails. They're not, and when we begin to dispute amongst the religions or within the religions, we're often disputing about the handrails, not about the essence, not about the mystery itself. And I say, keep us focused on that mystery, on that exploration.
So to some extent, I'm just thinking about whatever faith it is. One of the big handrails is the calendar of the week. So whether your day of worship is Friday, Saturday, or Sunday, just that regularity of a day of rest and a day of worship becomes an important handrail that helps you navigate your way through life. In terms of what you're saying about the mystery of faith, is that something that then a Quaker approach has brought to you in a way that you didn't have before? Because Quakers are far more, in my understanding, less in a sense about the handrails and more about reflection and coming to find the space.
The Quakers have their own handrails. They have their own, you know, no one can get away with it without having a structure. The structure, of course, is the meeting, the silence, the recognition that you're all waiting, and someone will only speak when they have something worthwhile to say and to minister to others. So it is a structure there. But what I value myself is that in the structure of the Anglican Church, just let me take my own church for a moment, in some ways it can be very busy. Stand up, sit down, you know, and then all the modern language, which frankly doesn't appeal to me greatly, because I love the rhythm and the poetry and the harmony of the old language. It was a rhythm, and it had a rhythm of its own. And for instance, the service of Evensong was a beautiful service, beautifully balanced, beautifully proportioned. And where that's gone, something is missing for me. Maybe it's giving something else to somebody else, but it's missing for me. And what is essentially missing in the Anglican way of service, and in many services today, is the opportunity for quiet reflection. Now, in the old days, we could go to the early morning service, the 8 o'clock service, or 9 o'clock, whatever it was, communion service, and you went in and it was quiet. And you can have a moment of quiet. And actually, for the whole of the service, if you wished, you could remain kneeling. Nowadays, up, down, everybody's chattering, treating it like a tea party. And, you know, well, there's a place for tea parties, but there's also a place for quietness and reflective opportunity.
Yeah, that time for reflection and the importance of liturgy as an anchor that helps you navigate your way through a service and helps you feel almost, I certainly speak from my experience, having the liturgy and recognizable in the background almost lets you zone into your own reflective space more easily than just silence. It gives you permission to reflect. Yeah. Let me ask you, so we've got a couple of questions that have come in. So the first one from Andrew in Oxford says, brilliant to see Terry looking so well, and we'd love to know what gets you up in the morning and what makes you go to bed with a smile on your face.
Yeah, well, I tell you, at the moment, before I go to bed, I've been watching on YouTube Old Time Music Hall.
Oh, lovely.
All repeated from the Palace of Variety, Leeds. That's just by the way. But actually, I would strongly recommend, if you like the old time shows, have a look at that, the Old Time Music Hall. It's all the BBC programmes have been repeated. But what gets me up in the morning is the fact that it's another new day. Where is it going to take me? I don't know. I know some of the things I've got to do or would want to do. I don't have to do them. And that's one of the blessings now of being in retirement. You don't have to do it. But I'm compelled to get up and to say, right, I'm going to do this chapter today. I'm going to finish this today. So I've spaced a day. And somehow over the past 2 to 3 months, I've almost unconsciously fallen into a pattern you know, of working so long in the morning. And I've been cooking for myself. And that's another thing. I've learned lots of new recipes, simple recipes, you know, that you can do for one. And I've learned lots of new ways to cook, different things. So again, something new. And usually try to vary the diet very considerably. Plenty of fruit, plenty of veg, and try and cook those. So it's. And I think
one of the things I remember you mentioned to me when we were speaking earlier was around the fact that you often or regularly do crosswords, but in lockdown you're now doing it online with somebody joining in the crosswords. Can you tell us how that works? Because that sounded a brilliant way of connecting to people. Well,
every night, I get to bed, and then I call or am called by a friend of mine, and we both happen to take the Times online. which to my mind is one of the best newspapers online. And living out in a village, that's an ideal way of getting a paper. So we take that. And for the past, 2 years now, every night we've done the Times quick cryptic together. Sometimes we have a go at the cryptic, which is often beyond us. But we always do the quick cryptic. I can tell you now, this may not sound brilliant, but last night we did it in 22 minutes.
Wow, that's good.
Last night was a good night. Usually it's 40 minutes, and occasionally it's 1 hour. But last night I'm proud of it.
That's brilliant. So we'll have to check in with you and see if you've beaten your own record in a few weeks' time. Yeah. We've got time for one other question. So this is from someone called David, who says, I believe Terry went back to Beirut many years later in 2012. What did you seek to achieve from that visit, and were you successful?
Oh, yeah. I went back because I believe very sincerely that I'd been through suffering, but so had the people who captured me. They'd had dreadful suffering too. And I think one of the things one tries to do is understand why people behave without necessarily condoning their actions. I wouldn't condone the action of kidnapping, obviously, but I could try and understand why they behaved as they did. And I've always felt about suffering that everybody suffers to a greater or lesser extent in life, and life isn't fair. Some people suffer far more than others. But I'm of the firm belief that in the majority of cases, suffering needn't destroy. Something creative can emerge from it. And I wanted to take my experience and to turn it round to enable it to be creative. So I went back to meet the people who had responsibility for my capture all those years previously. And they were surprised to see me. And I said, look, we've changed, you've changed, I've changed. Let's try and take something creative from this experience. So they said, what can we do? And I said, I've just come back from the Lebanese border. I've seen people who are cold and hungry and they've nowhere to go. And can you let me have heating oil for them? So they said, yes, we'll do it. That's a very, very small gesture. But I think there are opportunities we must give people opportunities for change. And we must, at the same time, try and take those opportunities, and there are plenty of them. And now, believe it or not, when I was 80, the Lebanese ambassador in London actually threw a small reception for me. The wheels had gone completely round.
Right, that's wonderful. So I think that message of reconciliation and looking at the positive, I know that if you look at Nelson Mandela and Robben Island in South Africa, other people who've been held captive a long time, what's amazing is how people can then find it in them. And you, a great example of that, to bring reconciliation to the fore and talk about how we learn from suffering, we learn from the difficulties people have, and give something back to the community around us for the world that we're now in and the future people have together. So Terry, I think we're going to have to stop there because we're out of time. It's flown by. I felt as though you've been in the room here with me. So it's been a fantastic conversation. Apologies to those who sent questions in that we haven't got to. Maybe we'll have you back at a later date. But anyone who wants to learn more about Terry, please do go to the Care Visions site where you'll find a couple of reminiscence short videos that he's put together. So thank you for that, Terry. Also, look at... Sorry.
Could I just say that if anybody has a question, a burning question, if they send it to you and you send it on to me, I'll try and reply.
Oh, that would be very kind. Yeah, so we'll say that to everybody. So if you've got a question and you haven't asked it, or if you're watching this recorded and not live, please do send your questions in and Terry kindly will answer them. So that's fantastic. Thank you for that. Please do also go to the Care Visions YouTube site to watch some of their videos. As Terry talked about, the power of music is very clearly demonstrated, where the dementia therapist, Laura, who presents those videos, uses music to bring things alive for people who otherwise feel sometimes disconnected. So Terry, thank you once again. Next week, we'll be back at 4 o'clock next Tuesday, when my guest will be Lenny Shawcross, the director of the World Dementia Council, who'll be looking at the global effort to tackle what is probably the slow burn pandemic. Probably in history will be remembered as having a bigger impact than coronavirus, but of course it's happening gradually rather than suddenly. So Lenny Shawcross will be with us next Tuesday at 4 o'clock. And then the following week, we'll have Sheila Robinson, who herself is a Quaker, interestingly, who's living with dementia, talking about her personal experience. And I'm sure she will pick up on some of the questions and issues that we've discussed today. So thank you, Terry, and thank you all for joining, and see you again next Tuesday. Have a good week.
Bye.
Bye.